general lecture series, the distinguished VNYI lecture series. Today we have Jenny Singleton, my colleague at Stony Brook Linguistics, relatively new to Stony Brook, and we're absolutely delighted that she's with us there, but we're also delighted that she's with us here at NYI today. Jenny's research is at the intersection of psychology and linguistics and education. She uses experimental and language elicitation, observational research methods to investigate sign language acquisition. And she's going to tell us about that today. So I won't, there's more information in her bio on the website if you want to see more about her particular research. But I will just mention one more thing, which is that Jenny grew up in a family of entirely non-hearing people. So she's the only hearing member of her family. Her parents and two brothers are deaf, and she's bilingual in ASL and English. And this was similar situation was depicted in the recent Oscar-winning film Coda that many of you may have seen, which made me cry for some reason. And that is the interesting fact of Jenny's background. And she's going to tell us today about advances in signed languages linguistics. And we all have a special request for when she does share her slides, because there's going to be a lot of her demonstrating, in addition to the slides being on, what we recommend is that you go with speaker view when the slides are on, so that you can see Jenny well, and make her bigger than you usually do, maybe when you're looking at slides, so that the slides and Jenny are approximately the same size. You can do that with the side-by-side mode, and that way you'll be able to see both her demonstration and what's going on in the slides, and that's really important for this talk. Got it? Okay. And then at the end, when we have a discussion, then it's good to come back with your cameras and go with gallery view, I think. So please welcome Jenny Singleton.
Thank you so much, John. Hi. So one nice thing that I think you can learn is the way that applause is done in the deaf community is this. And so I might be able to, see some of you doing that. So that's awesome. That makes me feel like I know people are attending. And it's also pretty useful for a Zoom environment. So are you able to see me clearly? And if you can give a thumbs up, a couple people that, okay, great. So I'm going to do screen share, and hopefully that will work properly. How about that? Can you see? How's that? Thumbs up? Okay, good. All right, let me just move away some of the. So it will be hard for me to kind of attend to the chat. So I've asked John or Vinny to chime in if there's a need for me to stop or figure out what I'm doing. I'm currently right now in Aspen, Colorado, but normally I'm at Stony Brook University in New York. So I know we have a mixture of folks who may never have learned anything about sign languages, and then, but some of you may know quite a bit about sign languages. So I'm going to try and have a kind of combination of basic information plus some advanced information about research that's going on. All right. So the first question is that I'll be talking about is who uses a sign language. I'll talk about the main question that so many people have is whether sign languages are universal or any kind of pattern that occurs across the world in their sign languages. I'll talk about national sign languages as well as emerging or village or family sign languages. And then we'll look at the linguistic structure, whether the organization of sign languages looks similar to the organization of spoken languages, ways that it's similar and ways that it's different. Oops. So who uses a sign language? Well, clearly people who cannot use a spoken language, either because they cannot hear or because they cannot speak. Sometimes it's a community of people who are deaf and use a sign language all the time. Or it might be a sign language might emerge in a very unusual circumstance where it's very noisy, like working in a lumber mill, or maybe monks who are in a monastery who have taken a vow of silence, but they seem to think that it's okay to sign on the side. Scuba divers. So these are contexts where you might find gesturing or signing is effective. So within deaf communities, we know that 95% of deaf people are born to hearing parents who don't know a sign language. So the question is then how would they learn a sign language if that's not their family language? If a deaf child remains isolated, then they might create what we call a home sign system for communicating with family members. So they'll create some gestural communication, and those are not considered full-blown sign languages, but extensive research on home signs shows that they show interesting rule-governed patterns. And in fact, a home sign used by a deaf child in China shares a lot of characteristics to a deaf child who's created a home sign in Italy or in the US. So that's a very interesting domain of research. But when deaf communities or deaf individuals are brought together, like at a school for the deaf, then they will create a full-blown signed communication system that will evolve into a natural language. And so, and from these kind of schools that have been created for deaf children, deaf communities then form from the graduates of those schools, and they stay very closely connected to those schools. So some interesting examples that you can read about are Nicaraguan Sign Language is a fairly recent natural sign language. But some of the older established sign languages like American Sign Language or French Sign Language have been around for over 200 years. Now that's relatively young compared to the duration of spoken languages, but again, sign languages have probably been around longer, but it's just the documentation and the histories that are still not as well documented. In villages where there are no schools that are organized for deaf children, or where there's more intermarrying, there might be a higher incidence of deafness. And so those are contexts where families or villages have created sign languages. And so those are also very interesting examples in the literature. So here I'm showing you just some examples of work on Nicaraguan Sign Language. Al Said Bedouin Sign Language has been studied by my colleague Mark Aronoff at Stony Brook. These are considered sort of emerging new sign languages compared to established sign languages, or what we might call national sign languages like British Sign Language, American Sign Language. Now, around the world, the boundaries between spoken languages and those of sign languages don't always coincide. So you don't have necessarily one spoken language and one sign language per country. Obviously, we know there are many countries with multiple spoken languages, and that's also true for sign languages. So for example, across Europe, there are 24 official spoken languages, but of course over 200 are used when you look at dialects and other quote non-official spoken languages. But in that same region, you would see 47 sign languages that have been documented. So you can just go to Wikipedia and type in list of sign languages, and you'll see by continent a lot of the different sign languages that have been documented. And they range from very emerging small family village sign languages all the way to national sign languages. Some examples of sign language families. French Sign Language was originally in France, but there are countries that have evolved from Old French Sign Languages. So for example, US, American Sign Language, Ireland, Mexico, Russia are all historically related to French Sign Language. So if I travel in France, we have about 40% shared cognates. I can understand signers in France, but by contrast, when I travel to England, people using British Sign Language, I can't understand them at all. So as an American Sign Language user, what that tells you is that the sign languages is not structured on the spoken language of that community, but they are indigenous languages that have different language histories compared to the spoken languages or in that environment. So another example, Japanese has sign language is connected to Taiwanese Sign Language and South Korea Sign Language. So just a little bit about the history of American Sign Language. So as I mentioned, we've come from France. So around 1815, one individual, Thomas Gallaudet, traveled to France in 1815 and brought back with him Laurent Clerc, a deaf man who was a graduate and a teacher at the School for the Deaf in Paris. And the two of them brought Old French Sign Language back to the US and established the first School for the Deaf in 1817, the American School for the Deaf. And so what ASL, contemporary ASL, is thought to really be a creolization of Old French Sign Language brought by these two men and existing home signs that were used by deaf individuals in New England. And then they also created some new signs. And so that is really the sort of early ASL, but now it's over 200 years in use within the US and Canada. It's hard to know exactly how many signers there are, but some estimates have been 300 to 500,000 deaf users. But there are also many hearing users of ASL like myself. So it's, the census doesn't ask about ASL. So interestingly, ASL has survived these 200 years, even though 100 years of that time, schools for the deaf banned sign language and switched to oralism, or asking, expecting deaf children to speak and not allowing them to sign. And these were residential schools, so it's a very interesting period of linguistic history that the ASL survived out of the classroom by peer-to-peer transmission in the dormitories. And so that peer language ecology is something that I'm very interested in thinking about acquisition of a primary language from children rather than from adults and parents. So just to give you a little sociolinguistic snapshot of the deaf community, once ASL was recognized by linguists, most notably William Stokoe, as a bona fide natural language around the 1970s, then the deaf community really identified itself as a cultural linguistic minority group in the United States. You may have heard of a convention of capital D deaf is used as a signifier of individuals who are part of this linguistic cultural group who identify as an ASL user. But that cultural identity is complicated. Individuals come into the community at all ages, especially given that ASL is not used in schools today. When they learn ASL, when they join the deaf community is very complicated, especially because ASL fluency is considered your passport into the community. But with so much variation, access to this community and you're getting an identity is problematic. Deaf identity is entangled with disability identity, accessing governmental benefits, getting interpreters, accessibility, accommodations, inclusion, diversity and inclusion conversations. So it's complicated because there are deaf individuals who do not feel disabled and don't want that identity, but at the same time, they want the benefits and the accessibility. And also, there's a lot of variation in the signing ability within this community. So it's a very interesting and complicated time right now to understand this linguistic cultural minority group. So moving to the question of whether sign languages what the linguistic organization looks like if it's similar to spoken language. So in many ways, the answer is yes, but there are some very interesting differences. And as I do research on American Sign Language, that will be my example language that I'll talk about today. So how is the lexicon or of American Sign Language organized? So Brentari and Patton have talked about a core lexicon of signs, a spatial lexicon, and a foreign lexicon, which is how they describe finger spelling. So I'm going to unpack each of these and tell you a little bit about the linguistic structure. Oops. Okay, so the structure of a basic sign in the core lexicon. So I'm going to play you a video of this sign. If you can see the gentleman in the purple, and there's an illustration there. So I'm going to play this sign for you. Okay, I'll do it again. Okay, so if you just put in the chat real quick, how do you describe that? How can you write about that? How do you characterize that? So think like a linguist, you know, how would you describe this sign? It means candy. It's pretty hard to write about. It's pretty hard to put into words. I'll play it again. Okay, so I'll also sign it for you. Okay. Okay, so nobody can describe it, or maybe I can't see anything in the chat. Okay, round object, kind of thinking about a sweet tooth, forefinger, wiggling, corner of the mouth, something stuck in your teeth. Okay, so some of you are describing the form, and some are describing more of a kind of iconic motivation or what it might mean. Okay, so what you can see is that this is a challenge for documentation. This is trying to think about how we describe signs. Another way that the same concept is by using finger spelling. So if you watch the signer on the video, okay, so she's spelling C-A-N-D-Y. Okay, so you can see that that's very different than a sign versus finger spelling, C-A-N-D-Y. And so this is important for the rest of the conversation today. So I'm going to be describing how we characterize a sign from a linguistic point of view. And then what is this finger spelling where you can spell out the word candy? Okay. So when we break down a sign, a basic sign has sublexical parts, and we actually call these phonemes. And so some have been a little troubled by the fact that we're using phone, P-H-O-N, phoneme, which sounds like a sound-based, but I urge you to kind of don't be so speech focused and think about phoneme as a kind of a theoretical construct of sublexical parts, meaning the parts that make up a sign. And so these parts are a hand shape. So many of you talked about a forefinger hand shape, a location here at the corner of the mouth or cheek, a movement, a twisting movement, and then sometimes palm orientation is important for a sign, but these are considered as a simultaneous expression of hand shape, location, and movement. So we can build up something that you would be familiar with as a minimal pair, right? So minimal pairs in English, like pat, bat, cat, rat. Well, we can do a minimal pair in ASL. So if you watch me, these three signs, summer, ugly, and dry. Summer, ugly, dry. Again, summer, ugly, and dry. And so one of those features is contrastive in those examples. So it's a minimal pair, and that is in location, right? So the hand shape is the same, the movement is the same, but the location is different. So that's a way that we can talk about the same idea of contrastive phonology or minimal pairs. So I've given this example, so I'm going to skip over that. Okay, here's another example of a minimal pair, two signs, possible and die. So I'll show you possible and die. Okay, so again, if you watch me, possible, die. So which of those four phonemes is the contrastive one? So put it in the chat. What is it? Hand shape, movement, location, or palm orientation? Okay, so I'm getting hand shape is a popular response, and that's correct. So the sign is exactly the same except for the hand shape. So that would be an example of a minimal pair. Okay, other characteristics of sign can include a change of hand shape during the sign. So the sign take advantage, if you watch me, it starts out like this, and it changes to another hand shape. So the hand shape changes in the middle. There can also be internal movement, like the sign color. That first sign was take advantage. This one is color. And so there's internal movement, like what we call a trill. Okay. And then there's also, it can be both sign movement and internal movement, like theory. So there's movement of path, and then there's movement of fingers. So, so that's a very interesting contribution to the phonology of sign that, and the discussions about syllables in sign, so that because a shape can change during a sign, we have to think about the characteristics of what can happen internally within a syllable. Okay, so now that you understand what a minimal pair is and how a core sign is built up of these sublexical parts that are expressed simultaneously, in fact, sign languages are thought to have fewer minimal pairs than spoken languages. Also, in spoken languages, the phonology is really mostly considered to be arbitrary. So yes, there are some words in spoken languages that are onomatopoeic or iconic, in the sense that, like cock-a-doodle-doo, like moo, words that are animal sounds sound like what they mean. But in sign languages, there are a lot of signs that look like what they mean, or the term iconic. So for example, if you watch me, the sign for bird, okay, so that looks like a bird beak, the sign for drive, and the sign for drink. Okay, so those would be iconically motivated signs, but we still consider them as a core sign with subparts, but the motivation sort of looks like what it means. And so some of you were talking about, how this might be a piece of something stuck in your teeth. You had a kind of iconic motivation. Now, there's been a lot of work on processing of signs. We know that in spoken languages, phonological neighborhoods or minimal pairs can interfere with each other when you're doing lexical retrieval. So it's of interest of whether that happens in a sign language. So I want to just quickly show you a database that is really been groundbreaking in some sign language ASL research. It's at asllex.org, and there are over 2,700 ASL signs with videos that include a frequency rating and iconicity rating, whether it's considered very iconic or low iconic. And and it breaks it down in terms of the phonological coding, what the hand shape, what the movement is, where the location, and it also gives a neighborhood density calculated using those three parameters of hand shape, location, and movement. And also there are some signs that include some acquisition data. So let me stop share and share a different thing. Okay. So you should see the ASL Lex website, and you can, it's really a fantastic and interesting database that has a visual representation. So I can, let me show this menu, and I can pick a dot and I'm going to get the sign for tomato, and you can see the video of the sign tomato. You can see some of the data about frequency, and I can, pick other phonological neighbors where the sign, so I'm going to just put in here true, and try and find that. Let me just see. Okay, so now it's going to go to true, and you can see that sign true looks like this. And then I can see right next to it is intelligent. Okay, so now you're going to see the sign intelligent, which looks like this. So you can see how these are phonological neighbors, right? Because they share a lot of the same characteristics. Also very interesting, this website allows you to look at the intersection of iconicity and frequency. So I can pick, like, this is frequency by iconicity. So I can have a highly iconic sign and highly frequent, and then it'll give me a list of signs. So that way, if I'm doing an experiment and I need some low frequency signs or high frequency signs, I can, or signs that meet certain criteria in terms of the sublexical structure, I can use this database to help build that. So that has been really a really cool technology breakthrough for folks who work on sign languages. So using that data is some current research that folks have been interested in understanding the structure of the mental lexicon. So Naomi Caselli at Boston University, who's worked on that ASL Lex database, and her colleagues have looked at things like reaction time, and whether you can see whether phonological structure or frequency or iconicity, whether those are competing as you try to retrieve signs in an experimental task. And in their work, they found that signers were slower to respond to low frequency signs that had many phonologically similar neighbors. So that means that phonologically related signs are competing for selection. But this pattern was not evident in high frequency signs, suggesting that those just get recognized easily before the lexical processing. So here is data from that paper. And so what you see here, and in fact, they had two populations. They had native signers, signers with deaf parents, and later signers or non-native signers with hearing parents. And so what you can see here is a kind of interaction effect on reaction time. So the higher the number means the slower, it takes longer to react. And what you can also see are the sign frequency. So what you can see is that for native signers, something that is a very frequent yellow doesn't really change over time. Like, people can get it, it's highly frequent. They don't need to be, they're not vulnerable to the interference of a phonological neighbor. But a low frequency sign, you can see that the more neighborhood density, the more competition there is, signs that look similar, if they're low frequency, it starts to interfere. But that interaction is interestingly not as prevalent in non-native signers. So we see that overall, the non-native signers are taking longer to respond, but also they don't have as much of an effect from the frequency of the sign as native signers do. So just interesting data, some recent research that just came out this last year. So with respect to iconicity, sign recognition does not seem to be influenced by something being more iconic. As I mentioned, compared to native signers, non-native signers are slower at recognizing signs and exhibited weaker neighborhood density by frequency interaction. So this is interesting. It parallels what we know about spoken language bilinguals who are slower in word recognition in their second language. So these non-native signers are slower in their recognition of signs. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the database and technology we have available to us now, at least for ASL. And to summarize, what that core lexicon that I've been describing is that signs are made up of sublexical parts. But there's more iconicity, but that there's evidence of the mental lexicon having a representation of phonology, and that phonological neighbors can interfere with each other when you're doing phonological processing. So now I'm going to move to the spatial lexicon and talk about two examples from the spatial lexicon, which are verb agreement and classifier construction. So verb agreement and also aspect marking use space and movement changes to the sign to show a grammatical process. So verb agreement, many verbs in ASL permit a modification of the path to indicate the subject and object. So for example, the sign give. So if you watch me, this is first person to second person. So I give you, and then you give me. So the subject, the sign begins at the subject and moves toward the object, or I give to a third person. So it's hard to see from these drawings, but the first person is signer, second person is addressee, third person is either an actual person or some arbitrary kind of, you set up in space your third person. And pronouns are essentially points to those three reference. But what's important here is that the verb can change its direction to incorporate the subject and object. So you're modifying the path to show that verb agreement. Now, but importantly, not all verbs can take all inflections. There are also some that are called plain verbs, and those signs cannot be modified in the way that give was. So, and these are signs that are called body anchored. So as I showed you, give, it just can move all around between the first, second, third person. But a sign like love, if you look at me, love. So I can't just do love. I love you, you love me, you know, because it's body anchored, there's a phonological constraint. And so now I have to say, I love you, or you love me. I have to use word order, subject, verb, object in this case to identify the relationship of who is loving who. So again, this is an example of how the phonological constraint of the sign is interacting with the ability to use verb agreement using spatial modification. Now, interestingly, the spatial modification of verbs to indicate agreement is really more prevalent in established sign languages. So in Mark Aronoff's work on Al-Said Bedouin sign language, and also some work on Kata Kolok in Bali, these are young sign languages. And those sign languages do not, the signers of those sign languages are not using this verb agreement using a spatial modification. They use word order, I give you, and do not use that kind of inflection strategy. So that's something that seems to evolve over time with the history of a sign language. Another way that signs can be modified is to mark aspect. So we understand the concept of telicity. So an event has a terminus, like to die or to arrive, that is telic, and that can be represented sort of in the sign itself. So that if you watch me, the sign die, okay, so there's a sort of a terminus, or arrive. So there's a sort of natural end in the sign's phonology, which shows that it's also telic. But you can also have a sign like walk, run, where it just doesn't feel like there's an end. It just sort of keeps moving. And those are atelic, and you can repeat these signs a couple of times and it just doesn't feel like it has an endpoint, but it also conveys that feeling of aspect. But interestingly, there are some signs that phonologically have an endpoint, like the sign sleep. Okay, so it feels like it ends, except sleep is not telic. It just is an ongoing act. So you cannot always be assured that if a sign has an endpoint that it is telic. So these are interesting phonological, aspectual tensions that one explores in this field. There's also reduplication. that can be applied. I won't go into this detail right now. And you can also do no movement. So if I do the sign look, but if I do stare, I just hold it still. So that's also expressing an aspect. So again, the way that you're moving the sign inherently can show aspect, but you can also mark it for plural. So plural can be marked by a repeating noun. So like if you watch me, child and children, child, children. So I'm repeating it. Similar to how Warlpiri repeats kurdu to kurdu to mean children, but you can't just do that with any sign. So like the sign girl, if you look at me, so girl, I can't just go to mean many girls. I usually would use a lexical form, many girls or several girls, but you can't just keep repeating a sign. It doesn't, that process doesn't always, is not always permitted. So I've just, this is a drawing. Again, I will, I need to add some references at the end of my talk. So I'll share that with your group if people are interested in having a copy of these slides. But this just shows how many different ways give can be modified for aspect, to give continuously, to give distributively. But again, all you're doing is changing the inner movement in a rule governed way. So the same kind of movement I do for give, I can use for another verb to show that same aspect. Now, another way that we can use the space around us to modify a sign is what we call classifier constructions. This is a very highly productive process where you can combine morphemes to form complex signs representing events and states. So in this case, the hand shape, so like that sign candy, we have a hand shape, but in this case, your hand shape has a meaning, a classifier. It can be a category of vehicles, humans, animals, flat objects, circular objects, and they're represented by a classifier. And so that can be, so like this classifier is for vehicle. Okay, this classifier is for tree. And so I can create a sign that is this, okay, again, and that means the vehicle narrowly missed the tree. I can also have a kind of swerving vehicle narrowly missing a tree. So I've built in manner, location, path to create a two-handed representation, a predicate that shows with and as a signer, you would know that there must have been a vehicle and there must have been a tree. And so these are, it's a very rich, productive system. In the sign linguistics area, people have also referred to some of the classifier construction as depiction. It's also been called constructed action, especially when a signer kind of becomes the narrator, becomes the experiencer. So if I'm, driving that car that narrowly misses the tree, but then I can become the driver and looking both ways. And, so you can become the speaker, so to speak, and engage in constructed dialogue. And so you use body positioning. So anyway, it's a fantastic storytelling language that is very rich, and it shifts between the narrator view and the experiencer view very easily. It's an amazing language. The other cool thing is that you have two articulators that can be used simultaneously. So you can, each hand can represent, a bird in a tree or the vehicle near the tree. It can also be both hands gripping a lawnmower or driving. You can have a hand showing a loaf of bread and another hand showing a slicing knife. So the fact that you can, in the single expression, have multiple parts. Again, we don't have two mouths, but we do have two hands. And so it's pretty cool that you can show these figure ground relationships. Simultaneity is pretty awesome. One more thing is that ASL also uses facial expression for grammatical purposes. So when you're signing, You can also show a facial expression simultaneously that can change or add meaning to that sign or phrase that you're doing. So a yes/no question has a raised eyebrow. A WH question has a furrowed brow. You can do an if/then marking, a negation marking. So these occur while you're signing. So the listener, so to speak, has to be taking in the facial expression as well as what's happening manually to understand the whole scope, syntactic and morphological scope of what's happening. Okay, so then to summarize our spatial lexicon, that signs have a kind of path and movement that can be modified for a grammatical purpose. These modifications are rule governed, and they are a movement template that you learn and can be applied productively across many verbs, for example. And that there's a very rich morphology that where you can leverage iconicity and use this 3D signing space with your two articulators and also your face to express a very complicated structure. And last is the foreign lexicon. And this is really what Brentari and Padden have talked about as fingerspelling. So fingerspelling, if you remember this example of candy, C-A-N-D-Y, it actually has a long history. It started, as much as has been documented, this fingerspelling system that is, it looks like this. So there's a hand shape for every letter of the alphabet. And then when you put it all together, so if you watch me, I am now finger spelling about as fast as I possibly can. So that's pretty fast. But you don't finger spell everything. What you do is it's almost like code mixing. You just kind of borrow this word from the foreign lexicon, typically English, and you can just stick it into your whole ASL narrative. It has been documented to come from Spain to France and now to American Sign Language. But remember, sign languages don't have a written form. And so users of national sign languages live in places where a dominant spoken language is used. There's a dominant writing system for that spoken language. So as bilinguals, they learn the written system, the orthography of the ambient spoken language. But in their signing, they still sometimes need to refer to the name of a street, some concept that may not have a sign. And so they may rely on this fingerspelling rendition of the orthography of English. Okay. Now, just a little bit about research on fingerspelling acquisition. You would think that you wouldn't be able to learn fingerspelling unless you could read, knew the orthography. But in fact, deaf parents use fingerspelling liberally with their infants and toddlers. They spell to them all the time, even though these infants and toddlers can't read. But what we have learned, Padden's work on fingerspelling, she suggests that children sort of learn it twice. They learn the envelope, kind of the gestalt. So if you look at me, bus is B-U-S. So if I spell that really fast, bus, it kind of just looks like this, like an envelope. It could be a sign. And so infants and toddlers kind of learn bus as this, and they might express it like this. So they're not really fingerspelling, but they have learned the gestalt of the fingerspelled form. And once they start to experience print and their family members are showing them their name in print and so forth, they start to learn the fingerspelled letters with the print orthography. And then they learn to fingerspell and show, represent the orthographies of the words around them, their name and such. So, it's a very interesting question about whether this is actually a great method for literacy. Maybe all hearing children who don't have signers in their midst should learn to fingerspell. It could be an interesting leverage for learning to read. So, there are many other topics that I did not have time to go into today, but I thought you might just be interested in, there's a lot of active sign language linguistic work documenting the linguistic structure of many world sign languages. That's still very much happening. People are interested in these emerging sign languages, and home sign really just, we have the opportunity to look at a language being born. We don't have that opportunity with spoken languages. So this is a very interesting domain of study. These sign language families, these histories, the cross-linguistic comparisons, looking at the historical change in sign languages, looking at sign dialects. There's a very interesting documentary that came out last year about Black ASL. And so a signing dialect within an African-American community in the US, distinctive sign patterns have been documented. More work on the deaf cultural identity, more work on sign language acquisition, and also what we call motherese or infant directed styles of signing. That's an area that I'm very interested in. How the brain organizes and processes sign language compared to spoken language. So many deaf individuals have language delay because, again, 95% of them have hearing non-signing parents, so they wouldn't learn sign language until they're 3 or 5 or 10. And so this language deprivation experience has some consequences. And so being a late learner after language deprivation or delay is something that folks are interested in. I myself work in the domain of trying to understand sign language disorders, if there's any kind of atypicality that happens organically within a signer. So we know there's work on stutters and dyslexia. Is there anything like that that occurs within sign languages? And there is a challenge in documenting a language that doesn't have a written system. So when we look at that ASL Lex, how are they, what interface can they develop that still shows video? The work of having to video record many exemplars and how to code it into a system that might have a community agreement on how to annotate and code signs. That's also still something that is people are very busy with. So again, I hope that sort of shows you as a menu of so many of the different things people are working on in sign languages. My own work, and there's my email address if you're interested. I work on some of the eye gaze behavior that is required for signing, and how infants who are exposed to a sign language have a different an accelerated eye gaze control. I'm interested in how the transmission of sign language, how non-parents, people like teachers and peers, are the primary linguistic models for deaf children from hearing parents. And as I mentioned, I work in the area of sign language disorders, and also how individuals who have a spoken language disability, like auditory processing disorder, maybe we shouldn't be having them learn a second language that's a spoken language. Maybe they should learn a sign language. That might be easier for them. So I'm interested in that as well. Okay, so I think I have made it within my time, and I'm gonna stop sharing and open it up for questions. So if you followed, you can tell me that you were listening. All right. Okay, so it might be helpful to me if someone like Vinny or John can moderate and kind of turn people on, just because I can't do that at the same time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jenny. That was fascinating.
Okay.
There are so many questions. I can tell hands are up. So I'm just going to take the hands. I know there's might be some in the chat as well, but let's go with the people with the hands up. Well, we have already 4. So let's just go in order. Marta, go ahead.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Actually, as I was listening to this fascinating presentation. A couple of questions formed. So they would be, first, do you happen to know if the Polish Sign Language is part of any sign language family? Secondly, and I will post them so that you have a shorthand while answering. Secondly, are iconic signs shared across sign languages, especially not cognate ones among those languages? And then the same, I would ask the same about the grammatical features like the facial expressions for question or negation. And thirdly is, but maybe that's the main, I will post all of them. The third question is maybe the main one. Is phonology, when you talk about sign languages, is it a metaphor that you say use for this lecture because we are linguists connected with the study of phonic languages, or is it an actual term in your field of study? Because there is no, there are no signs, right? So it seems that talking about kinetics or maybe topology might be a sort of, I don't know, first choice. I'm posting it.
Okay. Whoa. Okay. I'll take your last one first. So the notion, oh, thank you. So the notion of phonology is I used in this presentation, but also our field uses it widely. There was an attempt to introduce the term chairology, which I will type in here to all. Hold on. CHEROLOGY, kind of, you know, an analogy of charemes, which is like hands and fingers. And it just didn't really take off. And I think that the linguists, you know, in a period of time to gain credibility and to make sure that the spoken language linguists could get the concept of sublexical structure, they use the term phonology and just say, just live with it. You know, it's okay. Just stop thinking about it as in a sound-based way. Just be more theoretical and understand that it has a broader meaning. So our field definitely uses the term phonology. So the question about iconic signs, so it really, within each sign language, they will, you know, so for example, the sign to eat, you know, is in an ASL is this, eat, but, you know, if you had chopsticks and typically ate this way, you might choose that form, right? So they're both iconic, but it's about the experience and about, you know, users coming into a community of shared understanding, and you have the things around you. So they can both be iconic, but they may not pick the same feature. And
then would the sign for eating or the sign for bed would be one of the, say, few signs common or understandable, mutually understandable across British and American sign languages?
So it's interesting that when there are conferences of signers from around the world, you can just sort of make your way by using, you know, these iconic signs, and people can figure each other out very easily. Compared to a conference of different speakers, you just kind of stand there and go, I have no idea what that person's saying, unless they have a shared history, and you might sort of, if you're a Spanish speaker, you might be able to figure out Italian, or, you know, so, but, you know, it is, so we have this rich portfolio of comprehension and an architecture that allows, I think, for this kind of ability to mutually understand more easily through these iconic tools that we have. So it's fascinating that there is a thing called international sign. there's not a community of people who live and use international sign, but it gets kind of activated in these conference settings. And they've kind of created a shared understanding of signs picked from different sign languages that are most understandable and very much leverage the iconicity that's inherent in so many signs. But there are still lexical forms where somebody will sign something and I have no idea what it is. And so that's true. In terms of the family history of Polish Sign Language, I know it exists. I don't know. I think it's historically related also to French Sign Language, but someone can look up on Wikipedia. They have them organized by their histories and check on that for me. But there's also a kind of Austro-Hungarian kind of sign language. And so I'm not sure which it comes from. So
thank you. Let's keep going on, but there are a lot of people who want to ask questions. So let's try to limit it to one question per person if we can. DeAndre, you're next.
Yes, hi. Yeah, thank you so much. Excellent talk. I was curious about your research on it seems almost like it veers into the sort of speech pathology, communication sciences area. And I was particularly interested in the applications to Parkinson's.
Applications to what?
Parkinson's disease.
Oh, okay.
There's been sort of, studies on improvements in cognition, including language, in patients that have sort of exercise regimens and sort of intensive motor activity. And I was wondering if your language requires intensive motor activity, if there would be this sort of difference in like either when the onset of Parkinson's would take place or whether there's fewer Parkinson's patients that regularly use sign or indigenous signers. Do you have any knowledge sort of the role of sign language?
So that's a great question. Whether being a signer is a protective factor for sort of more mobility, leading to a protective factor for something like Parkinson's. I will say that I definitely have seen and know cases of Parkinson's in the deaf community. So it's not a ticket out of getting that disease. But in terms of thinking about a therapeutic approach, whether signing, especially if, so I know in the case of Parkinson's, there is a tendency to sort of lose the volume of your voice and quieter speech or less speech. And, maybe that occurs before your mobility limitations that occur with your hands. So it could be that teaching some signs for communication could be a way to extend communicative abilities. So I think that's really interesting. I know that, so I'm very interested in the communication sciences and disorders kind of connection to the applications of the signing experience. So there definitely is evidence of enhancements, cognitive enhancements of signing individuals. So better mental rotation skills. There's greater peripheral attention detection. There's visual spatial representation, memory for visual spatial information. So there's a lot of bonuses that come with being a signer. And so, so those could be applications that especially, so I've done some case studies of deaf signers who have perspective taking cognitive impairments, and that actually impacted their signing in a way that was impeding their signing. So so it can work both ways. Like you might be somebody who, it's unfortunate that you're a signer because the cognitive impairment you have wouldn't be a problem for you if you were a hearing speaker, but it is if you're a signer. So it can work both ways of something that might be a positive application, but also something that might make it more difficult for you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. Luba.
I wanted to thank you so much for this amazing lecture. I have so many questions, but I ask only one. So I'm wondering whether or not people who live in countries with similar, like where similar languages from the same family are like there are more language. For example, like people who live in the country which is English and French, for example, French in Spain, right? So where people talk French and people talk Spanish, whether or not the sign languages is more similar to each other than, for example, people who are speaking Slavic languages, something like that.
Yeah. A lot of it depends on the history of the education of deaf individuals in those countries. So you might argue that, you know, the distance between France and England should have allowed for both those spoken languages or those sign languages to be similar, but just a little bit of water, you know, turns out to separate people, and British Sign Language is so unintelligible to me. So it really depends on, you know, there's a fascinating history of in Germany, they rejected the French Sign Language. You know, that was a possibility for them, but they wanted to keep everything oral and no sign language for deaf people. So it also depends on the philosophy about disability and deaf people, whether they should use a sign language or not. And so those are, so that would be a barrier for a spreading of a sign language to other countries if their philosophy about deaf people was no sign language, which happens in many places. So, it really has to do not necessarily with geographic issues, but more about the philosophy about deaf people and their opportunity and their right to use a sign language as a primary communication. So it's political as well as opportunity, because deaf children, 95% have hearing parents. So they aren't the decision makers. It's other people making decisions about their language access. So if the people around them say, you will not learn a sign language, that's what their life will be. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa.
Yeah, thank you for this fascinating talk. I was interested, well, I got very curious about the example about birth that is finger spelled and then looks like a sign for children. Well, I'm interested about that because I'm working on infant directed speech in spoken language, but still. And I was wondering if this looks like a sign, if you could, what could we say that's some kind of baby talk? Like, could grown up use it if they want to imitate?
Right. So there are two. So yes, you're right. One could talk about this as kind of baby talk, a sort of ill-produced form by a child still learning. But there are many examples of lexicalized finger spelling in adults. So adults will sign bus like this. They will sign, so D-O-G, dog is, if you can see me, D-O-G. But when people spell dog, they do almost like this. It's become lexicalized. It's become more sign-like. And also when you say B-A-C-K, like to give back, you can move back, like it's become like back, BK. So there are examples in the adult community where a finger spelled form takes on a sign shape or a sign phonology. So both are there, but the examples I gave were just that children can, that first of all, that adults do fingerspell to children who can't read, and that children reproduce attempts, both maybe because they see the adult doing bus, but they also have examples of attempting to fingerspell, but they don't really know that it's individual letters. They just kind of give a gestalt. So, and then when they learn to read and learn the orthography, then they really can redo it and learn it a second time. So both are there.
May I ask a follow-up question? Sorry, I know. All right.
Yes,
what,
of course.
what is the actual sign for bus and dog? Like, would they be used if a finger spelling word becomes lexical, or a finger spelling sign becomes lexicalized? Do they become synonymous, or will they be replaced?
So in the case of bus, people's fingerspell bus. So, you know, it's so short that kind of creating a big sign for bus was like no point. Everyone spells bus, B-U-S. So, but there could be another example where a novel sign, you know, and some people sign it, some people fingerspell it. And I see sometimes where people ask, what's the sign for this? And somebody said, well, I sign it this way. Oh no, I just fingerspell it. You know, so sometimes you might see a duplicate entry of a fingerspelled and a signed form. That might happen.
Thank you.
Nicole.
Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm actually not very familiar with the topic, so it was really eye-opening. Recently, I've been reading a lot about bilingual hearing speaking children, and there have been many studies on, you know, how bilingualism affects children language acquisition and so on. So I was wondering if there is something similar on sign language. So 2 different sign languages, children who are raised bilingual in 2 different sign languages, and whether there are patterns similar to spoken language or if they are completely different.
So good, thank you for that question. So there are 2 domains of bilingual studies in the signing domain. So there are bimodal bilinguals, meaning people like myself learning both a spoken language and a sign language. So there have been some very interesting work on acquiring 2 languages in 2 different modalities. Like, does one come earlier than the other, or do you know, and all of the questions that we ask in the bilingual acquisition literature about whether there's a underlying shared lexicon, or are they always acquiring as 2? There's also the other question, which is individuals who are learning 2 sign languages simultaneously. And, you know, for example, my PhD student is deaf Norwegian sign language user, and his wife is a deaf American sign language user, and their children are growing up learning Norwegian sign language and American sign language. And so it is certainly possible, and but it's a domain of active research. But generally speaking, the patterns look very similar to what we see in spoken bilinguals. But there is some interesting and I think compelling evidence that in sign spoken bilingual are probably coming in earlier than spoken words. So on average, when you look at databases of children acquiring a sign in a spoken language, that their signs come in at age 9-10 months of age, and their spoken words come in around 12-13 months of age on average. I'll tell my own personal story of my own 2 children who I signed to. I would say 10% of their input. Both of them signed first at 9 months and then produced their spoken word at 13 months. And they acquired a large sign vocabulary before they spoke. And even though 90% of their input was speech and 10% of their input was sign. So I think there's pretty, you know, I think it's pretty compelling that somehow in this modality that cognitively babies are ready to communicate, but they just are limited because they're learning a spoken language. babies who get sign language are ready to express themselves at 9-10 months of age. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you very much.
That's very interesting. Thank you. So now I'm going to actually turn over the hosting to Vinny. But there's some questions in the chat, and there's Alexander with his hand up right here, but I want to bring out one question in the chat, which is just such a cool question, whether ASL or maybe others sign language have different words for the verb to speak a sign language versus to speak a spoken language. And I'm going to thank you, Jenny, because I have to go, but everyone is welcome to stay till at least 3. And so enjoy, and thank you so much.
Thank you, John, for inviting me to this. So, and if anyone has to step off, by all means, do that. So let me answer. So yes, so if I say, do you sign? I would say this. So it's, to sign, and then this is speak, a spoken language, and sign. And the sign for hearing people is this, which is like moving lips. And the sign for deaf people is this, so ear, mouth. And that comes from, I think, a gesture of saying like, I don't hear, I don't speak. And then it's just become this. But this means to sign. Okay.
Okay, and I think from there we can go to Alexander has his hand raised. And then after that, I can start addressing some of the questions in the chat as well.
Hi, thanks for the interesting talk. So you mentioned reduplication, and that some nouns could be reduplicated for the forming of the plural, and some cannot. So I remembered about the non-signed languages where reduplication is used mostly in the languages like Chinese or Malay, and I posted the examples in the chat. So it was quite unusual for me to hear that like Indo-European ISL is using this way to form the plurals. So could you tell a little bit more about reduplication and the formation of the plurals in ISL?
So I would say, so if I understand the question is just a little more expansion about the use of plural, where one modifies the sign to mean the plural form. And so like where the noun child and children, it is, so what I guess I'm going to say is, I don't think it's a widespread process of reduplication, but I think that the iconic motivation of the word child and the word children, or the singular and plural of that, is using reduplication to convey that. But as a process, you can't just sign any noun multiple times to mean plural. So, so I think that, and I guess in the classifier constructions, you can, so like this is a vehicle that's parked, and then I can use this to mean lots of vehicles parked. So there is a way that you can reduplicate within the classifier construction, but just to repeat a noun as a grammatical process is really, I think, quite rare. I'd have to think a little bit more about more examples. I can't right now off the top of my head. But I feel like it's more productive in the classifier construction predicates, where you can show multiple through that repetition process. And when you said Indo-European, I guess I just want to clarify that, as it happens, ASL is historically related to French, but we're not part of a sort of Indo-European spoken language family. It just happens that we have that thread of sign language family. I didn't really answer your question very well, but
No, I understood more or less. So probably my clarifying question would be: so in English there is a morpheme s or z, which means plural. So
yes.
is there any analog in ASL? So I don't know. I like thumb up. No.
Not
Okay.
that is, yeah, you would use a lexical for many, several. Now there's another thing called number incorporation. So I can do 2 of us, 3 of us, 4 of us, so I can incorporate the number into a sign. It's a very special process, but that's another way that multiple can be conveyed, but it's not a sequential affix like S. Yeah.
Okay, so it is kind of more of a fusional than agglutinative. Like if I
Definitely.
don't know, if I
Yes.
point
There's
at
almost
each-
no agglutinative. It's almost always an internal, that I hope is the message of today, is that it's a modification of the internal movement or path to change the grammatical status. I didn't talk about noun verb. There's a movement pattern that you can do a derivational morphology. So there's more there, but I just didn't have time to go into that today.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right, and so back up a little earlier into the chat, we have Shang Yu asked, do signers have some prosody-like features? I'm not sure if
Yeah. So there's so part of it is facial expression as an analog of prosody. So so you can do a question formation through adding facial expression, but there's also movement intensification that can, to show that something is, you're not just angry, but angry, like you could really intensely sign something. So there's, so that kind of prosody can be used, but from a grammatical scope, like WH question, negation, those are all done through this co-expression of a facial expression. So that's how prosody is done.
Okay, and then we have one more. I think this seems like the last question that's in here is Paulina asked, is there such a thing as spoken sign language code switching? Probably makes little sense from the community identity point of view, but I don't know.
So amongst codas or child of deaf adult like myself, like I feel very comfortable with another hearing signer to sign and then switch into speech and then to switch, or to even code mix. Because sometimes there's something that like is perfectly expressed in ASL and there's like no English word for it. So I would feel very comfortable switching back and forth with another coda. Now with a deaf individual, if they use speech, they might switch back and forth, but probably less so. I didn't talk very much about mouthing. So a lot of deaf people will produce some mouthing while signing. And so that's a very complicated product of years of speech therapy. And, it's a long discussion, but or nothing on their mouth, they don't even express any English mouthing. So it's a very interesting dynamic of this coexistence of deaf people living in a predominantly hearing community who use a spoken language, and they have been educated to have a kind of privilege of speech and maybe feeling like their signing isn't good enough. And, so there's many dynamics that are part of this idea of code switching and high and low and English-like signing that I didn't discuss today, dialect variation. So it's probably, I teach a whole course over a whole semester on this, on all of these topics. So it's a little hard to go into in detail, but there's two kinds of code switching, one for hearing signers and another for deaf bilinguals who are using English, but through print, through speech, and through finger spelling. That can be a way to switch between ASL structure and English structure.
Okay, so we have another hand up. We have Olga.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It's not maybe a question, but just kind of a speculation. So there is such a hypothesis, right, that, or used to be, that kind of pro-speech, yes, pro-language is rooted in gestures. Yeah, so at first, historically, people had gestures, and then only speech appeared. So just basing on what you mentioned about bimodal bilinguals, yes, that they acquire gestures earlier than speech. I'm just wondering, what do you think, just basing on your experience, about this hypothesis that the gestures could have been historically our pro-speech originally? Thank you.
So yes, there's, definitely some folks that have talked about, that maybe, our earliest ancestors, before our speech developed, we signed, and that when speech mechanisms developed, that, that speaking ended up becoming the dominant language modality, but that the vestigial gestures from the early signing is what we see as co-speech gesture. So, if I'm talking and I'm moving my hands, or if I'm saying, oh, just a little bit, please, like, why do I need to do that? And so that this kind of mental representation that invites gestures, but again, there's a lot of variation across cultures. In some cultures, it's not very polite to be very gestury, and other cultures are very gestury. And so I don't know. I do think that the modality is, it's interesting that, in modern human societies, we don't have an equal number of signing societies and speaking societies. So we, speech still ended up being the dominant modality for languages. And so, so somehow in human processing, that ended up being the privileged modality. And so can we figure out historically if signing was first? I think most people who write about this look more at the organization of the brain and the emergence of the left hemisphere as dominant for spoken language. But the left hemisphere is also where sign languages are organized predominantly. There's still some right hemisphere involvement. So, so I don't have an answer, but I do think that I do find it fascinating that hearing people who use spoken languages still gesture. Like, again, why do they need to do that? Because I do think that the modality is great for conveying visual, spatial information in a way that's easier to understand and to represent than a sequential, arbitrary set of phonemes. And so it's very useful to describe how something works. If you just go and observe mathematicians and physicists describing their work, they use their hands because it's just so rich for that. So I don't have an answer, but it's a very interesting question. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, and it looks like we have one more question from DeAndre, and I think that might be the last one that we have time for. We have the informal gathering starting at 3, so yeah, I think people may have started heading to that, but yeah, so I think after this, maybe we can wrap it up. So yeah.
I guess is DeAndre, is that similar to the question I was just addressing?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, thank you so much. One other thing that came to mind you're talking a little bit about transitivity, and right after that, I think you were talking about language acquisition. I was curious if anyone's looked into the order of like acquisition of like transitive versus intransitive verbs in sign language, whether like kids as they're developing, do they learn transitive verbs first or intransitive verbs, or
So
is
I
there any research in that area?
can't remember if I'm going to remember this or not, but I know that there is evidence in these home sign systems that I believe, if I'm remembering right, that there is a kind of ergative structure for these home sign systems, and Susan Golden Meadow has done a lot of this work on showing that, like, you can look at a home signing kid in one country and compare it to another country, and they seem, again, it may be that the modality invites that kind of arrangement of the, again, maybe the cognitive architecture and the way that it comes out in the modality just invites itself, even if you're a self-creator of a home sign system. They're, in this notion of like being easily understood across different sign languages. And if you have movement in verbs that show exchange of something from one place to another, it invites a certain kind of structure. I think that there's still a lot of room for cross-linguistic comparison of sign languages, but it's also very interesting in these emerging sign languages that spatial modification, even though give looks, like it's got to go from, the object goes from one person to another, it seems so that it would be inviting that in this sign. It doesn't seem to be there in the very early structures. So yeah, I'd have to go back and look again exactly how those child home sign systems are, but that's my memory of it. But whether you sort of think there is a kind of bio program of some sort, I think that there's very interesting. So one of my earliest pieces of work, it was my dissertation. It was on a deaf child acquiring ASL from his parents who were both late learners and signing in a way that was inconsistent and ungrammatical. But the child ended up extracting probabilistic patterns of just enough that it was, wiped out the noise and got the pattern that was operating at 60, 70%, and then boosted it to a 90, 100% in his own usage. So there's a suggestion that there may be bioprogram kind of structures, but there also may be just processes that that children look for regularity, statistical patterns. And if it's not there, they sort of try to make it happen and build it. But if it's absent, they may not invent it from scratch. So there were things that were absent in the parent's input, and he doesn't invent it from scratch. But if there was something there used probabilistically, then the child was able to grab it and overgeneralize and create a rule. So there may be something about the human cognition as a processor, along with the modality that might be shaping these kind of patterns. Sorry, that was a tangent, but hopefully talking a little bit about that.
Thank you.
Yeah. I know we're out of time, but I do want to thank everybody for coming today, and it was fun talking to people all over the world. So I appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for
Thank
the
you so much.
talk. It was lovely. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.